Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to today's Public Data University 301 webinar, Testing Messages to Support the Decennial Census and American Community Survey. This webinar is presented by the Association of Public Data Users and co-sponsored by the Census Project and the Leadership Council Conference on Civil and Human Rights. My name is Brendan Buff, Program Associate at APDU. APDU is a national network that links users, producers, and disseminators of public data. Our membership is very diverse: government agencies, higher education, think tanks, foundations, businesses, and entrepreneurs. Our weekly newsletter, annual conference, monthly webinars, and advocacy on behalf of federal statistical agencies has been a long-time benefit of APDU members. If you're not already a member of APDU, which of course I'm sure you already are, please consider joining today. APDU will hold a webinar on February 22nd on the Census Bureau's efforts to improve their data dissemination, including a new website to access all data products intended to replace American Fact Finder. Registration for this webinar has not yet opened. Be on the lookout for a marketing email in the near future. If you have any suggestions for future webinars, please send them to me at bbuff@crec.net. Our speakers today are Phil Sparks, Corinne Yu, and Celinda Lake. Phil Sparks is the co-director of the Census Project. Formerly, he was Associate Director for Communications of the U.S. Census Bureau. Corinne Yu is Managing Policy Director for the Leadership Conference on Civil and Human Rights, the nation's premier civil and human rights coalition. Ms. Yu is responsible for seeking and developing new program opportunities, coordinating policy development on priority issues within the coalition, and devising coalition-based strategies, and assisting in the day-to-day management of the policy department. Celinda Lake is one of the Democratic Party's leading political strategists, serving as tactician and senior advisor to the National Party committees, dozens of Democratic incumbents, and challengers at all levels of the electoral process. Celinda and her firm are known for cutting-edge research on issues including the economy, healthcare, the environment, and education. Today's webinar, co-sponsored by the Census Project, the Association of Public Data Users, and Leadership Council Conference on Civil and Human Rights, will unveil the results of a new national opinion survey on the use of effective messages in support of the 2020 census and the companion American Community Survey. Before we start our presentation, let me first mention a few things. In the webinar marketing, we mentioned that we would be distributing materials to all attendants. These materials will be distributed after the webinar and will be gone over during the webinar itself. Today's webinar is being recorded and will be available in the member area of the APDU website at apdu.org. All webinar participants are in listen-only mode. You can hear us, but we can't hear you. If you have any questions for our speaker, feel free to type them into the questions box, which you will find in the GoToWebinar interface. You can submit questions at any point during the webinar, but we will hold them until the end of the presentation. Now, let me turn things over to our speaker, first speaker, Phil Sparks. Phil, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Brendan, and I want to thank APDU, the Association of Public Data Users, for putting this webinar together, and also my colleague organization, the Leadership Conference, for joining us in co-sponsoring today. This survey was taken right after the election. It's a national opinion survey with an oversample, which Corinne Yu is going to talk about in a moment. But basically, its objective was to take a look at what were the best possible and most credible messages in support of Census 2020 and also the American Community Survey. I want to note here that this is not a survey to encourage its results, to encourage participation in the census, but rather to be used by advocates to advocate for proper resources for both the 2020 census and the American Community Survey. So with that, let me turn it over to Corinne Yu at the Leadership Conference and say one other thing in preface, and that is, as I said, for advocates. So you are free to pass this information along to your colleagues, but it is not available. It shouldn't be available to the press. It's a proprietary survey, nor is it a survey that should be shared with policymakers. It is for you, the advocates. Corinne, why don't you take it over now and talk a little bit about the oversamples.
Sure. Thank you, Phil. My name is Corinne Yu, and as Brendan noted, I'm Managing Policy Director for the Leadership Conference on Civil and Human Rights. Our coalition is charged by its diverse membership of more than 200 national organizations to promote and protect the rights of all persons in the United States. Ensuring a fair and accurate census is a top priority for the Leadership Conference and our members. That's why we're delighted to respond to the webinar. Our future prosperity goals are shaped in part by the accuracy of the data collected by the census on the population, national origin. The Spirit compile the most accurate data possible for the U.S. population. It must ensure a full account of all of its diverse populations. So importantly, as Phil noted, this poll included oversamples of African Americans, Latinos, and Asian Americans. In this way, we'll be able to provide these important stakeholder communities with information about the very best messages we can all use in our public discussion to promote a fair and accurate 2020 Census and American Community Survey. Thanks again for participating in the webinar. Phil, turning it back to you.
Thank you very much, Corinne. And let me introduce Linda Lake. Many of you all know her from her excellent polling that she's done recently and in the past on a variety of policy issues. We chose her firm because we thought she would not only be able to give us accurate information on where people are in terms of understanding the objectives of the 2020 Census and the American Community Survey, but also provide very useful information on how to message that to our public and policymaker audiences that advocates will need. So with that, we turn it over to Linda. Linda?
Thank you so much, Phil, and thank you for everyone on this call. We are very, very excited to have done this work, and we have good news to present, and I'm presenting on behalf of our entire team, Alicia Snell, Kate Gormley, Jesse Klein, who were involved in designing and are on this call. We did a focus groups first, and then we did a survey, again, of 1,000 likely voters with oversamples of African Americans, Latinos, and Asia Pacific Islanders. And I think very, very important that we were able, we call them oversamples, but we really believe this is just appropriate sampling to truly represent all of the voices out there. We did 3 focus groups on slide 4 of mixed gender white voters, African American voters, and Latinos. Slide 5 is just the distribution of the sample, which you can use for your own references. So let me turn to slide 7, which are a combination of key points pulled out of the focus groups and the survey. First of all, more so than we would have imagined, voters were very aware of the census and its purpose. And people thought of it as a core value that it was important for everyone to be counted through the census. This was true whether we gave background information on the origins and goals of the census. Whether or not people got that information, I'll show you the data, people thought it was very, very important to count everyone. It was also very powerful to tell people that the census was required by the Constitution. And people thought, wow, if that's the case, then we need to do it right. If it's in the Constitution, we need to do it right, and therefore we should spend whatever money it takes. People had no idea how much money it would take, but people thought, oh, wow, if it's in the Constitution, then we really need to do it right. We need to spend the money. It is slightly stronger to say that conducting the census is required by law rather than mandatory, and mandatory is the word that has become a little tainted in our society because of political campaigns. Although with Latino voters, it was powerful to say mandatory, but in general, it's a little stronger to say required by law. And of course, the Constitution is the ultimate law in people's minds. People also thought that it was important to fund it sufficiently and to conduct it efficiently, accurately, and reliably. The one word that didn't test very well in terms of the census was unique. People thought, nah, there's a lot of data out there. It's not that unique. And this data could be assembled in other ways. And they thought, why don't you just Google it? And you'll get it. And in fact, ironically, out of this research, one of the #1 strategies is to get Google to endorse the census. But people thought it needs to be efficient, accurate, and reliable. Accurate also tested better than scientific. Scientific people, a lot of people just didn't know what that means particularly. Accurate sounded like, yeah, that's what we should be doing. We don't want the inaccurate census. When talking about the American Community Survey, It also helped to describe it as timely, accurate, and reliable data that is collected and shared in order to make good decisions about services and programs. And it also helped to talk about the ACS as part of the census rather than a separate survey. People thought, well, the census is only conducted every 10 years, and many people knew there's a big interval between censuses. They thought things change pretty fast. We should have an update. But when you talked about ACS as a totally separate survey, then people thought, oh, I don't know if we can afford all these surveys. There's a lot of data out there. So talking about ACS as part of the census was an important part of the messaging effort. On slide 8, the top word that people associate with the census was essential, followed by fair and valid. There was a little bit of racial difference on the word fair. We'll show you that data in a moment. Very few people bought into negative words about the census. They didn't think it was outdated. They didn't think it was inaccurate. And frankly, they thought they had absolutely no way of judging whether it was too expensive or not. They did not think it was particularly intrusive or burdensome, and they did not think it would violate privacy. Although that's where a fuller description of the ACS sometimes got us into trouble, and people thought, well, there's the shorter version, there's the longer version. The longer version's asking a lot of different kinds of questions. In this case, often we got ourselves into trouble by offering more detail than we needed to. What was important about the messaging effort here is we didn't have to educate as much as we thought we might. We were better when we operated at the big values level and got into more trouble when we told people more detail than they needed to know. People were really nervous about being unable to assess the cost effectiveness. And one of the things we constantly did in the early testing was to claim this is cost effective, cost effective. When you're talking about it being essential and fair and everyone should be counted, then people really weren't that worried about how much it cost. When we talked about cost effectiveness, then people said, well, how much does it cost? And is there a better way to do it? And cost effectiveness actually tended to set their frame. When we talked about it being in the Constitution, being important for community services and the vote, then we set our frame. And of course, we all know from message research, which is the kind of research this was designed to be, is that the team that sets the frame wins the debate. And we saw that play out very vividly in the last election. Slide 9, if we look at our most compelling messages, and it really came down to a simple set of 3 core principles. The census is required by the Constitution. Community leaders use the data to analyze emerging needs of neighborhoods. It helped a lot to use that word neighborhood and community leader because it brought it down from something that was 2,000 miles away with pointy-headed bureaucrats to something that was immediately useful in my community. And the census determines how many members each state gets in the U.S. House and how the congressional districts are equal in population and representation. By that way, that language representation tested very well as well. And of course, one of the things you're seeing is here, we're trying to push some of the values-oriented language, like neighborhoods and representation. It was powerful to talk about a number of different kinds of institutions that use the data to make decisions. Schools, transportation, healthcare. What wasn't helpful was businesses. Now, this is voters, and that is very, very different from congresspeople. And to build support for the census, business leaders can be very, very important in talking to members of Congress. But for the voters, they said, hey, I don't want to spend my tax dollars telling Starbucks where to locate their franchises or how to compete with at McDonald's, how to compete with Burger King. And business has a lot of its own data themselves, and they can afford to pay for it. So the business argument wasn't very strong. It was more the services argument, which was not what we expected, and that was true even among Republicans. again, with elites, that could be different than what we found with voters. In terms of slide 10, you'll see here an engaged debate where we put our message up against their message, and we tried two different versions of our message. Actually, what we would do is combine the messages. But you'll see we didn't pull our punches in terms of the alternative message, which is the message in orange. We said it costs too much money, times have changed, it's outdated, it's expensive, it's not innovative. We should allow a modern survey without interviewing everyone. We could spend this money on other resources like schools, roads, and we're taking money from those programs to count everyone in the old-fashioned way that just doesn't make sense. So we had the change norm. We had the same services that we are actually maintaining. The census helps. You can see here we didn't pull our punches. We tried two messages. The first one was using some of the code for how the survey is conducted, valid, timely, to drive services and allocate services, and the Census Bureau must do it right. It must be funded sufficiently. We also had a message that went more to politics and government, but included the key phrase, the U.S. Constitution requires the census. And we would move that over to the left-hand side if we had this to do over again. You can see here we resoundingly won these message debates. And in fact, you'll see in a moment, once we frame the debate, or even if we compete with them, their message doesn't have a lot of energy to it. It's pretty easy to get people over to our side. And the toughest thing is that people just feel sometimes like they're not informed enough to second-guess some of this debate. There were some differences and some nuances by subgroup. I'll show you the data. This can be, slide 11 can be a resource for you as you look at different constituencies. So that's our conclusion, and of course it's work very informed by the work that, by the input entire advisory group, which was just invaluable in terms of thinking through how to talk about the census. Let's look at the data and see if you draw the same conclusion that we drew. So on slide 13, you'll see both informed and uninformed how important is counting everyone through the sentence to you personally. Very important, somewhat important, a little important, and not important at all. Basically, whether we informed or not, people said this is overwhelmingly important. I mean, this is like ratings of how important is the American flag and the 4th of July. And there's real intensity. The dark numbers here are the people who said it was very important. And you can see whether we provided information or not, people said it's very, very important to do that. Here's the language that we used in terms of informing people. And some of this is important for messaging, but it wasn't important to telling people that it wasn't critical in terms of informing people to have them think it's important. We have people at hello. 4th grade civics education does work, and people think, yeah, this census stuff is important. I've kind of heard of it, and this is important stuff. Slide 15 shows you the importance by racial category. And on the left-hand side, you have informed, and on the right-hand side, you have uninformed, meaning we didn't give them that paragraph beforehand. You can see that whether informed or not, all three groups, African Americans, Latinos, and Asian Pacific Islanders, rate the census as very important to count everyone. Whites did as well. And notice there's a little bit of erosion here among Asian Pacific Islanders. And we were so impressed that this coalition came together and found the money to survey Asian Pacific Islanders. They're an emerging and very important constituency in our country, but often, not often enough polled because it costs so much money to do so, and really want to credit the Census Coalition with doing that. Slide 16 shows you party ID. You want a bipartisan issue, you fund the census and count everyone in it. While this is has the potential to be very polarized in terms of elites. It is not polarizing at all among real people. And basically every region, every country, every part of the country, every partisanship, every demographic group said overwhelmingly it is very important excuse me, to count everyone in the census. So then we looked at some of the focus group comments, and you can see here people's initial, so this is before we've had any conversation, people's initial reactions to what is the census, and they really tend to know quite a bit about it, more than we might have imagined. It's a collection of data. It's information about people. It's statistics and numbers. It's counting the population. It's the population census. It's conducted every 10 years. It's door to door. They come around doing the census. I mean, it's something I've heard of. I wouldn't say I have a particularly good explanation of it or anything, but I've heard of it. When people talk about the goals of the census, which is slide 18, you see that people talk about funding, and much, much more than we had any idea. People make a very direct connection between community funding and the census. This is, and we did work on the census a decade ago. This is way, way more understood today, thanks to the good work of lots of the people on this call, than when we originally did this work. People also know that it determines elections and representation. They get a little confused. Sometimes they'll say it's the electoral vote or whatever, but they basically understand that it's representation and it's services at the local level, and both of those things are important to them. We pushed on that, though. We didn't just take people's initial reactions. So on slide 19, we explored the concept of counting everyone, including immigrants and undocumented immigrants. And people thought overwhelmingly that it was important, including people who had volunteered earlier on that they weren't that in favor of immigration or were Trump voters or whatever. They said everyone needs to fill it in. Everyone needs to be counted. They're there, they're getting the services, they live here, they're going to the schools, they're dependent on the resources. Everyone needs to be counted, even when we pushed. Now, this was a survey, as Phil remarked, and focus groups geared toward messaging the census. It was not geared to getting people to participate. But I will tell you, both before and after the election, we had a lot of Latinos very, very worried about whether undocumented or people with anyone undocumented in their family would risk filling it out. And that's a whole other challenge for another day. But know that everybody believed everyone should be counted, documented or not, immigrant or not. We then, on slide 21, looked at some of the wording nuances, and we asked people on a statement from 0 to 10, how important is this to you? And we said, conducting the census is mandatory for half the people, required by law for the other. So it's important that we fund it sufficiently and conduct it efficiently, accurately, and scientifically. Notice 3/4 of the voters believed it should, whether mandatory or required, it was important. 54% though said very important when we said required by law. There were some differences by demographics, which is on slide 22, and you can see that whites, African Americans, and Asian Pacific Islanders all tended to be more strongly in favor when it was required by law. Latinos actually more in favor when mandatory, and that may be some linguistic nuances as well. Democrats, independents all thought it was even more important when required by law. Republicans rated it within margin of error basically the same. Some people didn't know that the census is mandatory, but they also doubt that there's another way to get the information if it were voluntary. So people thought overwhelmingly, you have to make it mandatory, you have to make it required, or you're not going to get everybody in there. And then again, the real turnkey was when we told people it was required by the Constitution, because if it's required by the Constitution, it's in the Constitution, then yeah, we ought to do it really well, and of course everyone should participate. We asked people, we gave them two different descriptions, and we asked them how important is it to fund the ACS sufficiently with two different descriptions. On the left-hand side, the description was the answers help policymakers assess community conditions and needs and provides important trend data. On the right, we said the answers provide timely, accurate, and reliable data about people in the U.S. that are collected and shared broadly in order to make good decisions about needed services and programs. It is better and stronger to be more descriptive, and it is better to talk about services attached to good decision making. I think this also would be even higher if we had included community leaders, which tested very, very strongly, not just distant bureaucrats, but community leaders. On slide 26, you can see how important it is by racial group, and you can see again the providing data to make decisions really important in the African American and Latino communities. The Asia Pacific Islander community overall reacting more to the providing data to make decisions. The intensity is lower for Asian Pacific Islanders in both formulations, and that was something we tended to find throughout. Asian Pacific Islanders very supportive of the census and doing it right, but a little less intensity than African Americans or Latinos or even Anglos. Slide 27, you see it by party, and you can see again, providing data to make decisions, the stronger version with Democrats, Independents, and Republicans. And I think had we included local leaders, we would have gotten even more salience among Republicans. And you can see here that with that description, half of Independents and over half of Democrats say it is very, very important. So words matter, and they are essential to framing. And we often have lists of 10 words and totally lose people. So we wanted to pick the best words to use and to anchor our messages. And the number one best word is to say it's essential. Because people don't want to do something essential that is done in a half-assed way. And people thought overwhelmingly, well, if it's going to be determining local services and it's going to be determining representation, it is essential. And it ought to be essential to do it right. People also thought that fair and valid were good descriptions of how the census is today, although there was some racial variation on fair. And there was real intensity around that as well. Notice cost-effective, we have a very high undecided. It's second from the bottom. 29% said, I don't know if it's cost-effective. And people were really flummoxed about even guessing what the cost is. They didn't think it was cheap to interview everybody, but they had no idea what's cost-effective or even how much cost it would be. And unique, notice unique is not testing very well. People do not think the census is unique. And actually talking about it being unique contributes to people thinking, no, it's not, so we can get that data other ways. Talking about it being essential, required in the Constitution, fair and valid, that makes people want to do it right. Notice on slide 30, none of the negative descriptions tested very well. And while we need to worry about privacy because it will both affect response rates and affect how people support it, people don't think it violates privacy now. 71% say that is not a good description. And 2/3 don't believe it's intrusive or burdensome. Again, we see 33% don't know how to assess whether it's too expensive or not. They have no idea what the expense is, and that's not a dimension that we want to ride with voters. With elites, that's something different, but with voters, being on the cost dimension is actually setting the frame for their strength, not ours. So all of that data that I just showed you reveals how the census is portrayed in real people's minds. Now we looked at what was important to real people. And you can see, first of all, almost every aspect of the census is off the charts important to people. But the most important are accurate, valid, reliable, and fair. And those things, again, are as important to people as the American flag, as the 4th of July. When we asked importance, the one thing that wasn't very important was unique. People don't think it's unique, and they don't think it's very important that it is unique. Essential tested very strongly. Cost-effective tested strongly as important, but didn't overwhelm people's, didn't really drive support for the funding, and in fact tended to diminish support. Scientific, actually, terms were valid, reliable. The product of the scientific process, rather than maintaining it's a scientific process, because many people don't know how to judge a scientific process. And people thought it was less intrusive, less important that it was unobtrusive. They don't tend to think it's obtrusive now, and they didn't think it was particularly important that it would be unobtrusive. Slide 33 is graphing are things that are, how well does this describe the census, and then how important is it? And what you're looking for is the things in the upper right-hand quadrant. These are the things that are considered important and true today. Essential is in that category, fair, valid, accurate, strongly in those categories. On slide 34, there were some differences by race and ethnicity in terms of the words that were really important. And what was the group that was really unique tended to be Asian Pacific Islanders, and they had a little of uniqueness as we have been going through the data. African Americans and Latinos thought absolutely essential. That describes the census very well. They were a little less in agreement than whites that the census is fair. They pull back a little bit. African Americans also thought it was very important to be up to date, reliable, accurate, protecting privacy, and valid. Latinos also thought very important to be accurate and protecting privacy. Asian Pacific Islanders thought valid and fair describes the census very well, and they were more likely to say it was accurate, scientific, and reliable. This distinction that we have between scientific and being accurate, valid, reliable doesn't exist in the Asian Pacific Islander community. It exists in the white African American and Latino community where scientific really isn't bringing a lot on board. But to Asian Pacific Islanders, they thought scientific was something that describes the census very well. They were less likely to think it's essential. They also thought that it is extremely important to have it be reliable and accurate. And all across all of these groups, that combination of traits made people think we ought to be doing this right, we need to fund it. Again, people questioning how unique the data is, and they thought, well, there's a lot of data on Facebook, Business collects it, I don't know how unique it is, and I don't really think it's that unique, and uniqueness does not contribute to supporting the census and funding the census. Now, one of the things about these messaging and these words, we tested 10, 12, 20 words. We need to get down to 2 or 3. The average, people always say the 30-second soundbite. Well, the average soundbite is now 9 seconds. You couldn't get through a list of 20 words if you wanted to. Secondly, we need to repeat and repeat and repeat rather than be all over the map. The way we get repetition is have a small number, 3 things that we repeat and repeat and repeat. And thirdly, we might have to educate people if they had not been more in our corner, but people were overwhelmingly in our corner. So what we want to do is more reinforce and fill in what was already bringing them to the table. This is not a case, despite how the elite communication often gets out, where we have to convince people to be with us. In fact, we had many people there at Hello. Slide 37, we start to develop the messages, and it shows you the 3 top testing statements. And we judge statements not only by overall reach, but also by intensity. So we're looking at those dark blue numbers and how much people say something is very convincing. And you can see required by the Constitution, community leaders use the data to analyze emerging needs and locate services, and how many members each state gets are overwhelmingly the most convincing statements to sufficiently fund the census. The next set of statements are good, but they don't have a lot of intensity to them. And then one statement is weak, and that is used to enforce civil rights laws. Only 55% say that's convincing, and only 26% say that's very convincing. So people don't particularly think that that's a convincing reason to support the census. Slide 38 shows you the full statement of what we were saying in those truncated statements. They are in numerical order, so look at the first three. Notice the community leaders using the data to analyze emerging needs of their neighborhoods, plan for the future, then gets very specific in terms of services. And this is a point that Phil made as we were doing the research. That specificity here really helped. New schools, rec areas, hospitals, transportation, police, and fire. These are all things that people think are universally good for everyone. And then our equal population and representation. Slide 39 shows you the statements by race, and you will see that African Americans and Latinos, their top two statements, the community leaders for the services, and required by the U.S. Constitution. Asian Pacific Islanders, strong on representation, and the community leaders, less strong, significantly less strong than whites, Latinos, or African Americans to find convincing that it was required by the U.S. Constitution. Slide 40 shows you the messaging by party, and you can see here the Constitution and the community, very important to Democrats, very important to independents, along with representation, and services a little less important to Republicans, but strong on Constitution and on representation. I want to leave plenty of time for questioning, so I'm going to skip here the focus group comments, but they just show you some of the texture of what we incorporated in the messaging. So let's jump ahead to slide 45, which is the engaged debate. And you can see here we have the two engaged debates that we did in the summary, relying on the data versus too much money, and census at risk versus too much money. Both of them powerful. Notice not a lot of resonance. Throughout the survey, there was only about a quarter of the voters who were hardcore anti-funding of the census. And even they didn't always feel that intensely about it. Our swing vote is actually more people who are undecided. And part of the source of the indecision we found in the focus groups was honestly people just need a very simple values-oriented answer. Getting too much into the weeds, too many details, too many numbers actually lost people. Slide 47 shows you the second bar is our best testing message, and it shows you among Latinos the services are really, really important, community services, very important among Asian Pacific Islanders as well. And you can see here the Constitution, very important for the independents. Democrats love the census and want to fund it no matter what it's doing. And Republicans really feeling strongly about the local services component. So again, some nuances, but what our major finding here is that this broad brush of being at the values level, people having a basic understanding of the census, and then our three top message points being that it is required by the Constitution, that it provides data on changing circumstances and about needs to community leaders in local communities for services like police and fire, schools, transportation, hospitals, and that it is key to representation and allocating so that everybody is allocated, congressional districts are drawn that are equal in population. Those 3 points are our key points, and the key is when people think it is required by the Constitution, they just think you ought to do it right. If we're going to do it right, they think you ought to spend the money it takes to do it right. So let me pause there, and I'll turn it back to you, Phil, if there are any additional comments or things I forgot, and then glad to take people's questions and comments.
Let's go to Brendan with perhaps some questions that have come in during the recitation of the results. Brendan?
Great, thanks, Phil. So we will now begin the question and answer portion of the webinar. Please type your questions into the questions box, which you will find in the GoToWebinar panel. First question, to clarify, when talking about the importance of counting everyone, does that mean, for example, 8 people in a home with 4 adults, 2 teenagers, and 2 small children under 5, counting all those individuals? They ask because so often families are now living together due to a number of reasons.
You know, it's a really good question. So we did talk about the inaccuracies and accuracies. We talked about double counting, and we talked about undercounting and missing some people. And basically what we found in the focus groups and in the research is that counting everyone is really more a core value statement than a technical argument. It's not transactional in that way. Like, everyone is everyone. Just go count everyone. And everyone's here. Everyone's living here. Just go count everyone. And so it is less a question, and in fact it did not help us to raise overcount, undercount, kids in households, all this kind of stuff, because people thought, oh boy, if it's this flawed, then maybe we shouldn't spend the money because we're never going to get it right. It raised more issues than it had. For people, this is just, the Constitution requires it. It's for services at the community level and for representation, and if it's that important, it's required by law, then you just try to do it right, and doing it right means counting everybody.
Great, thanks.
Sure, thank you.
Next question. Are there service providers to help with the completion of the survey? If not, are others within the community, such as organizers or advocates, able to help support people in completing the survey?
Let me take that one, since that's more of an operational question. They've yet to work it out, but in previous censuses, community organizations and community organizers and others who are tied to the community certainly have encouraged people to get the census done, and they're going to decide exactly how to get that accomplished, through whether they will have to come through some special process or whether they can just fill the form out. That hasn't been decided. In previous censuses, it's been fairly simple. The communities can do that themselves if they have to. Next one, Brendan.
Did you find that people conflated the meaning of drawing congressional districts? Did they think that the Census Bureau draws those districts?
No, good question. No, they thought it provided the population count. We have done a lot of work on redistricting, et cetera. We know, first of all, that people have no idea how half the people have no idea how the districts are drawn. But no one, there was a little confusion about electoral votes and things like that, but mainly because we were doing this right after the election. But no, people didn't think the census drew the districts, but a really good question. And in fact, most people have no idea how the districts are drawn.
Yeah, and this is Phil Sparks again. One thing we did notice in the focus groups, we did a focus groups before the election among African Americans in Richmond, Virginia, and they'd just gone through a court challenge to the congressional redistricting. And although they weren't exactly sure how it was done, what they did know is that they were disadvantaged. And I think that that's certainly the case with some of our other communities of color too. Brendan?
Okay, thank you. So this research explains how to effectively communicate with the public. Has there been similar research on how to effectively communicate with legislators?
Well, let me give a partial answer to that and turn it over to, so we would love to do research like that. But I will say this, the public is an important conduit to the legislators. So presenting this kind of information is really important in terms of building support among legislators because, you know, one of the things I always say that I love about polling is that conventional wisdom is wrong about 95% of the time, plus or minus 5%. And when it comes to Washington, it's more like 110% plus or minus 5%. So you've got a lot of assumptions, as you all know better than I do. The census is unpopular. People don't know what it is. They think it's too costly. They don't see any purpose in it. They think it's outdated. Absolutely not right. They think it violates your privacy. Now, we want to be careful about the privacy point, but no, they think overwhelmingly it doesn't violate your privacy. So it's really, really important to be able to dispel those notions. Then you've got a tier of legislators who I think would be very supportive, but assume, oh, I'm not going to talk about the census. I'm going to get killed on this. I'm going to have X, Y, or Z group coming into my town hall and just giving me hell on this. I'm not going to do this. And what you can dispel here is, no, here's the language you can use, and frankly, it's quite popular. Contrary to conventional wisdom, it's quite popular.
So I think the answer is that while more research, I think Celinda's a pollster would heartily agree, is always needed. This language transforms and transfers to policymakers almost entirely, simply because the numbers are so overwhelmingly in our favor, I think. Brendan, next question?
Sure. Whose minds were changed the most after giving information? Were conservatives swayed more because they were more skeptical to begin with?
Oh, that is a really good question. And actually what we found is we started out so high that not a lot of people changed their minds. Some of the movement in the survey with information was actually Asian Pacific Islanders because they tended to have less information, less intensity. It wasn't that they changed their mind, they just increased their intensity. But no, actually, most people didn't change their mind because they had nowhere to move. And I think the great thing that is liberating about this project, we don't have to create these opinions. We have to tap into them and elevate them, which is a totally, we've all been on task, right, where it's like, oh, the public totally doesn't get this, and we're going to have to completely convince them, or we can't even get past go. That's not where we're at. We're way past go already. We just have to activate what people already believe.
And with conservatives, this is Phil again, when you use required by the Constitution, as Celinda said, that's like the apple pie 4th of July and the American flag. I remember I don't know what the word would be. I remember going into a congressional office of a very conservative member of Congress, and when I said that this was in the Constitution, required by the Constitution, they basically snapped to attention and said, if it's in the Constitution, then we've got to do it, almost saying the same words as our focus group and our poll. So I think the fact that required by the Constitution brings conservatives into the game on a very overwhelming basis. Brendan?
Thank you. Next question. This respondent would like to congratulate you on a great piece of work. They would also like to see the data for whites as well. Can this be shared with City of Detroit officials as a beginning step in design the campaign for the census?
Yeah, I'll do this one. If it's a policymaker, the answer would be no, but if it's somebody that will be working as an advocate to advance the cause of fair funding, full funding for the census and for the ACS, the answer is yes. So just remember, this is not a public poll for dissemination to the media, nor is it a poll that we want to share with the policymakers. It is simply a poll whose first focus is for advocates like yourself on the phone and your colleagues, and you're certainly free to share this with your colleagues and colleague organizations who will be doing the same thing and advocating for full funding for the census and for the ACS.
And just so you know, and that's such a good question, thank you. The white data is essentially the total data. Because whites are the vast majority of the sample, and because everybody's agreeing, everybody has basically the same position, the reason we didn't actually graph numbers as whites is because those total numbers are what the white numbers are essentially, because 71% of the sample is white, which is what you would have among likely voters. This is a sample of likely voters. if you guys need anything graphed separately or for the purposes of advocacy or whatever, we would be delighted to, that should just go through Phil, but whatever Phil says you guys need, we're glad to do. Because
the point is that when you look at the demographics of this poll, they match up exactly with the population. So, for instance, I asked Celinda to take a look at Trump voters versus Obama voters, and actually there was no movement at all that was of significance, so I didn't ask her to put it in the poll. But there may be other, for instance, rural voters. Are they different from suburban voters? We might be able to do something there, perhaps regions of the country. But the thing is, I think, is that this is such overwhelmingly good data that the numbers aren't going to change significantly, and the messages, therefore, that Celinda has recommended, obtain with all groups in all parts of the country, all demographics, all ethnicities, all communities of color, with the exceptions that Celinda noted in the presentation. Brendan?
Thank you. Next question is the ACS at a disadvantage because of its name. How can we tie it more obviously to the census?
I'll try that one, and then Celinda.
That's
actually,
a great
I think the
question.
name is
I
well.
love that question.
I think the name is well chosen because it is a community survey, and it denotes that it is used by communities to, as we noted in the presentation, it's used by community leaders to address community and neighborhood needs. So I think it's better to actually have called this a community survey than some other name that denoted it came out of Washington or it came out of a state capital. But I'll turn this over to Celinda for the naming.
I totally agree with you. And I think the other thing about it is, honestly, ACS sounds to people like a technical term. And so ACS part of the census, or whatever way you feel comfortable saying ACS blank census, that just makes it sound like, oh, that's a subparagraph of the census. Oh, okay, fine, good, let's go. So just making sure that you bring the word census in, I think, is the key there. But it's a great point that you're making too, and I totally agree, Phil.
Now, I will say one thing, that there may be a difference with policymakers. For instance, the genesis of the American Community Survey goes all the way back to the Founding Fathers. That may mean something to them, but to the public, American Community Survey works because of the emphasis and focus on community. Brendan?
Yes. Let's see. Next question. From what this respondent can see from the results, Latinos seem most likely to believe that not everyone should be counted in the census, or not everyone is counted. Do they share examples or anecdotal stories from their communities? Relatedly, the Latino respondents spoke to fears of the census being used to identify and deport undocumented residents. Have you drawn conclusions about the need for strategies to ensure accurate counting in that community specifically?
So I'm going to turn that to Phil, because that wasn't the goal of this survey, but it certainly elevated the survey. And I mean, and we did the focus groups before the election. We did the survey after the election because we we were worried about it, and people were saying, because we've read people, the Latinos, all kinds, now these are Latino voters always, we read them all kinds of information about how we would be, it's illegal, it's never been done, blah, blah, blah. And one very poignant person said, listen, in this age, there'll be somebody running behind the census taker, grabbing that piece of paper out of their hand and deport my aunt. So yeah, that was not the goal here. We looked at only voters, but there is no question that's going to be an issue, and I'm sure the census is well aware of it.
Yeah, again, this is Phil. That's an operational issue more than a political issue. Clearly, on the political side, Latinos, as along with other communities of color and the general population, overwhelmingly support the messages and the goals of the census and the American Community Survey. But I'm certain that the Census Bureau on the operational side is doing work on that exact question that you've asked, because it's going to be important. But remember, too, that the survey, this is a sample of, you might call them semi-upscale elites, because these are These are voters, people who said they voted in the last election. That already takes out some portion of the rank and file Latino population because we were positing our messages to people who are going to have more interaction with the political system to make decisions than with the rank and file ordinary citizen who's not registered and perhaps apolitical in terms of the system itself or can't vote. Brendan?
Are these results being shared with the Census Bureau itself to inform its promotion efforts?
Yes. We did a briefing that included people from the Census Bureau about a week ago, and actually I think there's some additional ones on the phone today. Clearly they are doing much more polling even than we are, and their objective clearly is to operationalize their results so that they get a good count. Brendan?
I think we'll wrap it up with one last question. What is the single most important message that should be used?
Linda? Well, we may have lost her. I'll do it. Basically, it's that this is required by the Constitution. We can't. It cuts across all political stripes, all race and ethnicities, etc. That is the most important message that we ought to be conveying to the public. Brendan, let's turn it back to you for some wrap-ups, and then I'll have a word to say before we end.
Okay, great. Thanks, Phil. Thanks to everyone for joining us today and for your questions. Thank you, Phil, Karine, and Celinda for giving such a useful and informative presentation. I think this will be really helpful for people in the future. Again, the full webinar and presentation will be made available on the APTU website at aptu.org. As soon as it is posted, all registrants will receive an email with a link.
And one final word, first again to thank our co-sponsoring organizations, APTU and the Leadership Conference, to also say one or two things. That is, when you do these messages, keep them simple. We have invested a lot of time and effort to come up with the exact words that you all use. I think it's very important not to freelance, that these words work, they're credible. If we're talking to the public and the policymakers, they'll make a difference, and we hope that you will use them and keep it simple. As Celinda said, the more complicated we get about these things, the less support we garner. That's usually the case in terms of message development anyway. But in any case, thank you all very much. You can receive the information another day or so electronically, and any questions that you have, please feel free to contact me, Phil Sparks, at psparks@ccmc.org, or if you want to look at our website, which is thecensusproject.org, with additional information about the census and the ACS. That's all there. So thank you all for joining us today, and let's go up and make sure that we get the public energized about the census. Thank you very much.
All right, thank you.